My name is Tessa, and I am 32 years old. 10 years ago, my father secretly registered a toxic shell corporation using my social security number. He dumped his failing business debt onto me to protect his country club lifestyle, ruining my credit before my adult life even began. He told our relatives I was just bad with money. For a decade, I worked 3 jobs to dig myself out of a hole I did not dig. Then last night, my golden boy brother stood in a crowded ballroom in Dallas, begging the anonymous CEO of Vanguard Capital to save his collapsing real estate empire from foreclosure. When the CEO stepped onto the stage and took the microphone, my father dropped his glass of scotch and it shattered across the marble floor. Before we get into the details, please take a moment to subscribe to Maya Tells Stories, but only do it if this narrative truly resonates with you. Also, please drop your age and location in the comments. I really want to know what chapter of life you are navigating right now. Now, let me take you back to a Tuesday evening in Dallas, Texas, to an upscale steakhouse, and the exact moment my family decided I was nothing but a rough draft. The scent of seared ribeye and aged oak hung heavy in the private dining room. We were supposed to be celebrating my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. Instead, we were attending another coronation for my younger brother. Richard, my father, raised a glass of 20-year-old bourbon. The heavy gold watch on his wrist caught the dim chandelier light, a watch he purchased last month while claiming he lacked the funds to help with my medical bills. Beside him sat my mother, Brenda, swirling a glass of red wine, wearing the vacant, practiced expression she reserved for family gatherings. Across from me sat Chase. At 28, he wore a tailored cobalt suit that projected new money. He made a point to drop the keys to his leased Porsche Carrera right next to his bread plate, ensuring the waitstaff knew exactly who they were serving. Chase was the golden boy, the visionary real estate developer supposedly reshaping the city's skyline. To family, Richard boomed. His voice carried the gravelly weight of a man who believed every room belonged to him. And to the future of the Henry legacy, Chase, your new Apex development is going to put us in the history books. Chase smirked and raised his own glass. Just making you proud, Dad. Doing what I was born to do. Richard offered a deep, rumbling laugh. He clapped Chase on the shoulder, then gestured loosely in my direction with his glass. You know, Richard said, his eyes crinkling with amusement, Tessa was just the practice child, the rough draft you write before you figure out what you are actually doing. Chase is the masterpiece. The table erupted. Chase let out a loud, barking laugh and pointed a finger at me. Brenda offered a mild, tight-lipped smile and took another sip of her wine. No one looked at my face to gauge the impact of the words. They did not have to. In their minds, I was just Tessa, the quiet administrative assistant who lived in a sensible apartment and caused zero friction. I smiled. It was a reflex, a muscular contraction I had perfected over 3 decades. I did not argue. I did not demand an apology. Arguing implies you believe the other person values your perspective. When the waiter approached holding a black leather folio, Richard conveniently looked away, deeply engrossed in a story about his golf handicap. Chase picked up his phone and started scrolling. The expectation was clear. I reached into my purse, pulled out a matte black corporate card, and placed it on the silver tray. The total was $1,200. I signed the receipt without breaking my serene expression. Happy anniversary, I said, standing up from the table. I have an early morning. Drive safe, Tess, Chase muttered, not glancing up from his screen. Try not to get a speeding ticket in that sensible sedan of yours. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the thick, humid Texas night. The valet brought around my unassuming Audi. I handed him a $20 bill, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door. The heavy thud of the car door sealing out the city noise felt like a definitive period at the end of a very long sentence. I merged onto the highway, watching the skyline blur into streaks of neon and glass. Something fundamental shifted in my chest. The era of protecting their fragile egos had officially expired. They thought I was a secretary. They did not know that the matte black card I just used was issued by Vanguard Capital. They did not know I was the anonymous founder and CEO of the most successful private equity firm in the state. And more importantly, my father and brother did not know that Chase and his masterpiece real estate empire were currently bleeding out, hemorrhaging cash, and facing imminent collapse. Tomorrow morning, Chase would wake up desperate. He would start looking for a lifeline, and I was going to make sure he knocked on my door. The following Sunday morning, the illusion of my brother began to fracture. I arrived at my parents' sprawling brick estate in the affluent northern suburbs of Dallas for our mandatory family brunch. The house was a monument to manufactured wealth. It featured towering columns, imported marble entryways, and vaulted ceilings designed to make anyone standing inside feel small. My mother, Brenda, was arranging a platter of catered pastries on the kitchen island, blissfully ignoring the tension radiating from the formal dining room. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, nursing a cup of black coffee and scrolling through a tablet. I took my usual seat near the corner, playing the role of the dutiful, invisible daughter. 5 minutes later, the heavy oak front door swung open. Chase did not strut inside with his usual practiced swagger. He moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. His expensive golf shirt was wrinkled at the collar, and a thin layer of sweat coated his forehead, despite the central air conditioning running at full capacity. He bypassed the kitchen entirely and dropped a thick, leather-bound briefcase onto the polished wood of the dining table. The brass clasps unclicked with a sharp snap. Chase pulled out 3 glossy, spiral-bound portfolios and shoved them toward our father. "The apex is hitting a temporary cash flow hiccup," Chase announced. His voice was too loud, lacking its usual smooth cadence. "My primary institutional investors are getting cold feet because of a minor supply chain delay. They are threatening to pull their second round of funding. If I do not show a massive influx of capital by the end of the month, the city is going to revoke my zoning permits and the whole site goes into default." I sat silently, watching the panic bleed through his designer clothing. This was the masterpiece my father had boasted about just a few nights prior. "I need a bridge loan," Chase continued, leaning over the table, his palms pressed flat against the mahogany. $5 million to cover the construction gap. The private equity lenders will approve the advance, but they demand hard collateral. I need you to leverage your retirement accounts and put a second mortgage on this house. It is just for 90 days, Dad. Once the pre-leasing checks clear, I will pay you back with a 20% return." Richard stared at the glossy cover of the portfolio. He did not open it. He did not scrutinize the financial projections or ask for an audited balance sheet. Throughout my entire life, Richard never demanded accountability from his son. When Chase wrecked his first vehicle at 17 by racing on a wet highway, Richard quietly purchased a better model the very next week. When Chase dropped out of his first tech startup, burning through $500,000 of seed money, Richard blamed the market and funded his next venture. "Whatever you need, son," Richard said, his voice thick with unearned pride. "We build legacies in this family. We do not let temporary setbacks stop our momentum." Chase exhaled a long, shaky breath, dragging a hand through his hair. "There is one small administrative hurdle. The private bank ran a preliminary stress test. My personal credit is temporarily over-leveraged due to the initial land acquisition. They need a secondary guarantor to underwrite the risk. A cosigner with a pristine, verifiable credit history and 0 outstanding corporate debt." The dining room fell silent. Richard shifted in his heavy leather chair. His own hidden liabilities and creative tax accounting meant his signature alone was not enough to satisfy a modern compliance officer. They needed a clean financial slate. They needed someone who lived within their means, possessed a flawless credit score, and held a steady corporate income. Slowly, both men turned their heads and looked directly at me. Richard reached across the table, grabbed a silver pen, and placed it on top of the contract. He slid the heavy stack of paper toward my side of the table. He did not phrase it as a question. He did not ask for a favor. He issued a unilateral edict. "Sign the guarantor line on page 14, Richard commanded. "We have a meeting with the loan officer tomorrow morning." I looked down at the documents resting inches from my hands. From a quick glance at the summary page, my trained eyes instantly dissected the math. The projections were a work of sheer fiction.
The square footage valuations were artificially inflated by 40% above the Dallas market average.
The pre-leasing agreements listed on the appendix were soft letters of intent, not legally binding contracts. Chase was not building a legacy. He was orchestrating a massive financial illusion. And if the bank auditors dug even an inch beneath the surface, the entire portfolio bordered on federal wire fraud. I did not touch the pen. I raised my chin and met my father's gaze. No. The single syllable dropped into the room like a lead weight. Chase blinked, his frantic energy pausing as if he could not comprehend the sound. Excuse me? I am not signing these documents, I stated, my voice calm and rhythmic. I will not attach my legal name or my personal credit to a venture that lacks fundamental structural integrity. The facade of the happy, prosperous family disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Chase slammed his hands against the table, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "You selfish, jealous spinster," Chase sneered, spitting the words across the room. "You have spent your entire life pushing papers at a mediocre desk job. You live in a tiny apartment and drive a boring car. Now you finally have a chance to be part of something visionary, something that will actually make a mark on this city, and you are trying to sabotage it out of pure, pathetic spite." I absorbed his venom without flinching. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a defense of my lifestyle. Let him believe I was a fragile secretary. Let him underestimate the woman sitting across from him. Richard stood up, his heavy chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a thick finger at my face, his features contorted with rage. "You owe your brother this favor," Richard roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Family supports family in this house. We look out for our own. You will pick up that pen and you will sign the paper, or you will pack your things and leave." I looked at the man demanding blind loyalty and felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over my chest. This was the exact same man who refused to co-sign my modest student loans a decade earlier. He told me that building character required personal sacrifice. He forced me to work night shifts at a diner and scrub floors just to afford my textbooks, while he simultaneously paid cash for Chase to join a luxury fraternity and rent a penthouse near his campus. The hypocrisy was not just present, it was the very foundation of our household. "Family supports family" is a convenient slogan when you are the one asking for money, I replied, standing up from my chair. But the math on these pages is fabricated. You are asking me to co-sign a lie. I will not fund your financial suicide. Richard slammed his fist against the mahogany wood, rattling the expensive coffee cups. "You ungrateful brat. I am officially washing my hands of you. You are no longer welcome in this house. When the Apex Tower opens, when your brother is standing on the cover of magazines holding $1 billion valuation, do not come crawling back to us. You will be left in the dirt where you belong." I picked up my purse and adjusted the strap over my shoulder. I did not shed a single tear. Tears imply you are losing something of value. I was merely trimming dead weight. "Good luck with the bank, Chase," I said, turning away from the table. I walked down the long hallway, pushed open the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the blinding Texas sunlight. The heat washed over me as I walked toward my car. I knew exactly how the next 48 hours would play out. They believed banishing me was their ultimate weapon. They were entirely oblivious to the reality of the corporate lending market. The private bank would run a standard compliance audit and reject Chase by Tuesday afternoon. The traditional lenders would instantly smell the fraudulent projections and lock their doors. Chase would run out of conventional options before the week was over. Desperation would force him to seek high-risk mezzanine debt from the shadow lenders operating in the downtown financial district. He would have to submit an emergency bailout application to the most ruthless private equity firm in the state. He was going to walk right into the waiting jaws of Vanguard Capital. 70 floors above the concrete grid of downtown Dallas, the atmosphere inside the executive suite of Vanguard Capital was a study in calculated silence. Down on the street level, the city hummed with erratic noise, traffic, and frantic ambition. Up here, secured behind soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass panels, the environment was immaculate and perfectly controlled. True power does not need to shout. It operates in quiet, air-conditioned rooms where fortunes are dismantled and rebuilt with the stroke of a fountain pen. I stood near the window holding a ceramic cup of black tea, watching the morning sun reflect off the neighboring skyscrapers. 72 hours had passed since I walked out of my parents' house. I knew the exact sequence of events that had transpired in my absence. My brother had undoubtedly spent Monday morning sitting in the plush offices of traditional commercial banks, flashing his perfect smile and handing over his glossy portfolios. By Tuesday afternoon, the risk management algorithms at those institutions would have flagged his inflated projections. By Wednesday, the rejections would have piled up on his desk, polite but unyielding. The heavy mahogany door to my office opened with a soft click. Chloe stepped into the room. She was a senior partner at Vanguard and my most trusted proxy. Cole wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried herself with the sharp, undeniable competence of a woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry. We shared a mutual understanding built on ruthless efficiency. She handled the public-facing negotiations, allowing me to maintain my anonymity and control the board from the shadows. Chloe walked over to my desk and dropped a thick, cream-colored dossier onto the polished glass surface. "We have a live one," Chloe stated, her voice carrying a dry, clinical amusement. "A distress signal from the residential development sector. The applicant is requesting a rapid injection of $5 million in mezzanine funding to cover a catastrophic cash flow gap. They are desperate to close before the end of the fiscal quarter." I turned away from the window and walked toward my desk. I set my tea down and opened the heavy cover of the dossier. The crisp white pages detailed a financial disaster of epic proportions. Printed across the top header in bold black ink was the name of the borrowing entity, Apex Luxury Developments. Below that, the primary applicant's signature read, Chase Henry. He had run out of legitimate options faster than I anticipated. Panic has a reliable way of accelerating bad decisions. I scanned the executive summary. Chase was asking Vanguard Capital to act as his savior. He was courting the apex predator of the Texas private equity market, entirely unaware that the firm was architected by the very sister he had deemed a worthless spinster. "Look at the debt-to-equity ratio on page 4, Chloe noted, tapping a manicured finger against the glass desk. "He is bleeding capital. His primary institutional backers have halted their scheduled payouts due to a missed supply chain deadline. The man is trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of loose sand." I turned the page, my eyes scanning the rows of fabricated numbers. The math was even worse than the glossy brochures he presented at the family brunch. He had padded his asset column by listing soft letters of intent as secured revenue. It was a brazen amateur tactic. But the most revealing piece of information was located in the collateral annex on page 9. To secure the $5 million bridge loan, Chase had listed a secondary guarantor, Richard Henry. My father had actually done it. He had signed over the deeds to the sprawling brick estate in the northern suburbs. The document detailed a senior lien against the property, pledging the fully paid-off family home as hard collateral to back his son's failing project. I stared at the address printed on the page. That house was my father's ultimate monument to his own vanity. He purchased it when I was 12 years old, demanding that the entire family worship the imported marble entryways and the vaulted ceilings. When I was 18, I sat in his rich leather study and begged him to help me secure a modest student loan for my university tuition. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses and refused. He told me the house was a sacred family trust, an untouchable asset that could never be leveraged for something as uncertain as my education. He forced me to work 3 separate jobs to fund my own survival. Yet here it was, bound by a paperclip, casually offered to a shadow lender to protect the fragile ego of the golden boy. "We are going to approve the preliminary meeting," I told Chloe, my voice maintaining a steady, rhythmic cadence. Chloe raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her features. "You want to fund this sinking ship? The risk profile is astronomical. He is one missed inspection away from total default. We are not funding a ship, I corrected, closing the dossier. We are purchasing an anchor.
We will provide the $5 million he requires, but the structure of the loan must be inescapable. I walked around the desk, outlining the specific trap. Draft a mezzanine agreement with an accelerated default trigger. We take the senior lien position on the residential estate. He is scheduled to present his Phase 2 zoning permits to the City Council in exactly 3 weeks. Make that the primary performance milestone. If he misses that deadline by a single hour, the grace period is waived. Vanguard legally seizes all listed collateral immediately. No extensions, no arbitration. Chloe smiled, a slow, predatory expression that matched the severity of the terms. It was a financial guillotine. If the applicant stumbled even slightly, the blade would drop, and the firm would acquire a multi-million-dollar property for a fraction of its market value. I will have the legal team finalize the paperwork by noon, Chloe said, picking up the dossier. The applicant is practically begging for a sit-down. I can schedule him to come into the penthouse for the final signatures tomorrow morning. Do it, I instructed. Chloe nodded and exited the office, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Alone again in the quiet expanse of my suite, I walked over to my secure terminal. I opened a web browser and navigated to a secondary profile. I typed my brother's name into the search bar, pulling up his public social media presence. Chase was actively broadcasting his own demise to the world. His feed was a curated exhibition of unearned arrogance. The most recent post was uploaded just 20 minutes ago. It featured a high-resolution photograph of Chase sitting in the driver's seat of his leased Porsche, wearing designer sunglasses and holding a cup of overpriced coffee. The caption below the image read, "Big moves happening today. When the traditional gatekeepers try to slow your vision, you skip the line and play with the big leagues, securing the bag and building the skyline. Never bet against the apex." He had attached a dozen meaningless tags about hustle culture and visionary leadership. He truly believed he was outsmarting the system. He thought he was walking into a boardroom filled with faceless, bureaucratic bankers who could be charmed by a firm handshake and a confident posture. He assumed Vanguard Capital was just an algorithm, a giant vault of money waiting to be unlocked by his sheer charisma. I watched his digital hubris with a clinical detachment. He was weaving the rope, tying the knot, and placing it firmly around his own neck, all while asking his followers to applaud his craftsmanship. My father was equally culpable. Richard had co-signed the destruction of his own legacy out of blind, patriarchal pride. They had banished me from their dining room table, certain that I would fade into obscurity while they ascended to the ranks of billionaires. They were so blinded by their own reflected glory that they failed to recognize the shifting landscape beneath their feet. The trap was fully authorized. The legal net was drafted with flawless, impenetrable precision. There was no way out, no hidden loophole they could exploit once the ink dried on the final page. I reached for my desk phone and pressed the intercom button to reach Chloe's extension. "Yes, Tessa," Chloe answered instantly. "Regarding the signing meeting tomorrow morning," I said, staring at the smiling photograph of my brother on the monitor, "you will take the lead chair. You will present the contract and represent the executive board." "Understood," Chloe replied. "Will you be monitoring from the secure feed?" "No," I stated, turning off the computer monitor. The screen faded to black, leaving only my reflection in the glass. I want to be inside the conference room when he signs away his life. I want to watch his hands. There was a brief pause on the line before Chloe spoke again. "If he sees the CEO in the room, the dynamic of the negotiation will shift. He might attempt to appeal directly to you. He will not be speaking to the CEO," I explained, walking toward the heavy oak door of my office. "He is going to be speaking to the junior notary. Prepare the standard non-disclosure protocols. I need a stack of blank files, a pair of thick reading glasses, and a fresh ink pad for the official state seal." The strategy was set. The predator was waiting.
Tomorrow morning, the golden boy and his arrogant father would walk right through the front doors of my empire, entirely ready to sell their souls to the practice child. The polished brass doors of the private elevator parted on the 70th floor, signaling the arrival of the prey. I stood safely behind the frosted glass partition of the secondary observation room, watching the lobby feed through a security monitor. Chase and Richard stepped out onto the imported Italian marble, bringing the loud, suffocating heat of their unearned Texas arrogance directly into my sanctuary. Vanguard Capital was designed to intimidate. The reception area featured soaring 30-foot ceilings, minimalist leather furnishings, and a panoramic view of the Dallas skyline. True wealth whispers, but my brother and father only knew how to scream. Chase wore a sharp pinstripe suit, adjusting his silk tie and checking his reflection in the tinted window panels. Richard trailed slightly behind him, speaking at a booming volume on his cellular phone, intentionally projecting his voice so everyone in the room could hear him discussing golf handicaps with an imaginary associate. A junior receptionist, a brilliant young woman holding dual degrees in finance, stood up behind the curved reception desk to greet them. "Good morning, gentlemen," the receptionist said, her tone professional and steady. "Welcome to Vanguard. Whom are you here to see?" Chase did not stop walking. He did not look the young woman in the eye. He waved his hand dismissively through the air, treating her like a malfunctioning automatic door. "We are here for the Apex closing," Chase announced to the empty room. "Tell the partners the talent has arrived." I watched the monitor, feeling a cold, clinical satisfaction wash over me. Their hubris was a blinding disease. They believed they were walking into a temple built to worship their supposed genius, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were stepping onto an execution block. I turned away from the screen and looked at my own reflection in the mirror hanging on the observation room wall. The undercover protocol was fully implemented. I had shed the tailored designer blazer and the commanding aura of a chief executive. I wore a drab beige cardigan over a stiff white cotton blouse. I had pinned my hair back into a severe, unflattering bun, pulling the strands so tight they pinched my scalp. A pair of thick, wire-rimmed reading glasses rested on the bridge of my nose, distorting my cheekbones and hiding the sharp contours of my face. The physical disguise was rudimentary, but the psychological camouflage was impenetrable. I did not need Hollywood prosthetics to deceive my family. I merely had to adopt the exact persona they assigned to me decades ago. Growing up, my role in the household was to blend into the wallpaper while Chase absorbed the spotlight. I was the practice child, the invisible administrative assistant who existed only to facilitate their comfort. I was stepping back into that familiar, invisible skin, using their own chronic narcissism as my primary weapon. I picked up a heavy stack of legal folios, holding them tightly to my chest, and walked out of the observation room. I navigated the back corridor and pushed open the heavy oak door leading into the primary boardroom. The expansive room was flooded with natural morning light. Chloe sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table, projecting the unshakable authority of a senior partner. Chase and Richard sat across from her, their posture wide and dominant, attempting to consume as much physical space as possible. I entered silently, keeping my head bowed and my gaze fixed on the polished wood floor. I moved with the practiced, submissive shuffle of a low-level clerk. Chase did not look up when the door clicked shut. He was too busy leaning over the table, trying to charm the senior partner. Chloe maintained a polite, glacial expression, refusing to return his wide, manufactured smile. I placed the stack of legal folios onto the corner of the table, organizing the pages with methodical precision. "You, sweetheart," Chase snapped, snapping his fingers in the air without turning his head. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Fetch me a black coffee, 2 sugars. Make it quick, we have a city to build." The command was degrading, yet it filled my chest with a thrilling, icy anticipation. I offered a silent nod, turning toward the silver beverage cart resting against the far wall. I poured the dark roast into a porcelain cup, stirring in the exact amount of sugar he demanded. I was serving the men who disowned me, playing the obedient servant while holding the ultimate executioner's switch in my pocket. I set the saucer down next to his legal pad. Chase ignored my presence entirely, taking a sip without offering a word of thanks. I stepped back, fading into the shadows near the frosted glass wall, waiting for the performance to begin. "Mr. Henry," Chloe said, directing her attention to my father, "Vanguard Capital is prepared to authorize the $5 million mezzanine advance for the Apex development. However, our risk management division noted significant irregularities in your initial liquidity declarations." Richard bristled, his face flushing a dull shade of pink. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the obsidian table. He was a man accustomed to bulldozing local contractors, and he mistakenly believed the same tactics would work on Wall Street veterans. "There are no irregularities," Richard countered, his voice dropping into a patronizing growl. "My personal assets are vast and deeply diversified. I have built a regional empire over 30 years. You are looking at a temporary cash flow bottleneck, not a structural deficit. My son possesses visionary genius. He is holding the keys to the most lucrative residential zoning map in the state." I stood in the corner, listening to my father lie with effortless grace. He spoke about his vast empire, conveniently omitting the string of toxic shell corporations and leveraged debts he left behind in the late 90s. He was offering an illusion, packaging his son's incompetence in a shiny box of patriarchal bluster. Chloe did not blink. She merely tapped a manicured finger against the primary document resting in front of her. "We appreciate your optimism," Chloe replied smoothly, "but Vanguard does not underwrite visionary genius. We underwrite tangible leverage. The board has approved the advance, but the terms are non-negotiable." Chloe slid the heavy folio across the smooth surface, stopping it right between Chase and Richard. She opened the cover and flipped directly to page 14. "I direct your attention to the accelerated default clause," Chloe instructed, tracing a line of dense legal text with her silver pen. "We are taking the senior lien position on your primary residential estate in the northern suburbs. The capital will be released into your escrow account this afternoon. In exchange, you must present the finalized Phase 2 zoning permits to the City Council in exactly 90 days. Chase scoffed, taking another sip of his coffee. 90 days is an eternity. We will have the permits stamped and filed in 6 weeks. "Let me be explicitly clear," Chloe interrupted, her tone dropping 10 degrees, slicing through his arrogant interruption. "If you miss the 90-day milestone by a single minute, the grace period is instantly waived. Vanguard Capital will legally seize the listed collateral immediately. We will take possession of the Apex site, and we will foreclose on your family home. There is no arbitration process. You are betting your entire legacy on a municipal deadline." The boardroom grew unnaturally quiet. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of genuine hesitation cross my father's eyes. The reality of the gamble hovered in the air. He was risking the roof over his head, the marble entryways, and the vaulted ceilings he worshipped. All he had to do was read the fine print, recognize the lethal trap, and walk away. But Chase did not hesitate. The golden boy reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. "Do not worry about the fine print, Dad," Chase said, flashing a dazzling, empty smile. "I will double their investment before the quarter ends. These institutional types just like to hear themselves talk." Chase pressed the gold nib to the paper, signing his name with a series of aggressive, looping strokes. He slid the folio over to Richard. My father looked at the signature, looked at his son, and allowed his blind pride to override his survival instinct. Richard gripped the pen and signed the guarantor line, legally binding the family estate to the shadow lender. Chloe collected the document, verifying the signatures with a swift glance. She turned her head slightly, signaling the junior clerk standing in the corner. "We need the official seal," Chloe stated. I stepped forward, pulling a heavy brass notary stamp from my pocket. I walked up to the obsidian table, standing mere inches from the men who told me I would be left in the dirt. I looked down at the crisp white paper. The ink of their signatures was still wet, gleaming under the recessed lighting. I placed the brass stamp over the designated square. I pressed down with my palm. The mechanism engaged with a sharp, heavy thud. The trap was locked. The snare was pulled tight. The deeds to their lives now legally belonged to the daughter they banished. Chase stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a triumphant flourish. He reached across the table, offering his hand to Chloe. She accepted the handshake with a brief, professional nod. Richard clapped his son on the back, his chest puffed out with manufactured victory. "Pleasure doing business with you," Chase declared to the room at large. "You just funded the future of Dallas." They turned and walked out of the boardroom, their loud voices echoing down the hallway as they celebrated their supposed mastery of the financial system. The heavy oak door swung shut, sealing the quiet atmosphere back inside the suite. I reached up and pulled the thick, wire-rimmed glasses from my face. I pulled the pins from my hair, letting the tight bun fall loose against my shoulders. The suffocating disguise melted away, revealing the architect standing underneath. I looked down at the stamped document resting on the table. The 90-day countdown had officially begun. Chase was going to burn through that $5 million with spectacular incompetence. He would miss the zoning deadline, and Vanguard would drop the hammer right when he felt the most untouchable. They were already sending out invitations for the elite Dallas real estate gala, preparing to celebrate a triumph that would never arrive. The margins were set, the timeline was fixed, and the public reversal was waiting just over the horizon. The 90th day arrived with the sterile precision of a digital clock striking midnight. Inside the Vanguard Capital server room, a proprietary risk management algorithm scanned municipal filing databases across the state of Texas. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the City Council zoning office closed its doors. The Apex Development Phase 2 permits were never submitted. The system registered the absence of data. A single automated notification materialized on my desktop monitor. Breach of contract confirmed. Chase had squandered the $5 million bridge loan with breathtaking speed. Instead of allocating the funds to structural engineers or expedited supply chain logistics, he funneled the capital into glossy marketing campaigns, securing billboard space along the interstate and hosting lavish promotional dinners. He treated the mezzanine debt like a limitless personal slush fund. He believed the city bureaucrats would grant him an extension based purely on his last name and his tailored suits. He forgot that municipal deadlines do not respond to charm. Chloe walked into my office holding a single sheet of watermarked paper. The margin call was drafted. It did not contain a polite request for a timeline update. It offered a blunt legal ultimatum. Chase had exactly 48 hours to produce the principal, $5 million, plus the stipulated penalty interest. If the wire transfer did not clear our routing numbers by the deadline, Vanguard would initiate immediate foreclosure on all pledged collateral. This included the commercial development site and the sprawling residential estate owned by my father. Execute the protocol, I instructed, signing my stylized initials at the bottom of the notice. Send it via certified courier to his corporate headquarters and his personal residence. Do not place a courtesy phone call. While the courier navigated downtown traffic to deliver his financial death sentence, Chase was busy adjusting his tuxedo. The Dallas Real Estate Gala was the premier social event of the season, hosted in the grand ballroom of the city's most opulent hotel. It was a gathering of power brokers, wealthy investors, and local politicians. Tonight, the committee was scheduled to present my brother with the Rising Star Award. The irony was a masterpiece of timing. Growing up, Chase was perpetually rewarded for the illusion of achievement. When we were younger, he received a blue ribbon at a regional science fair for a motorized architectural model our father secretly paid a local engineering firm to construct. Chase stood on that middle school stage smiling, accepting a trophy for work he never touched. 2 decades later, the scale of the fraud had escalated, but the dynamic remained identical. He was about to stand on a stage and accept an industry award for a luxury high-rise that was nothing more than a dirt pit and a mountain of toxic debt. Richard was attending the gala as his primary guest. My father loved these events. He thrived in rooms filled with crystal chandeliers, expensive champagne, and the sound of clinking glasses. They were both living inside a suspended bubble of delusion. They had not checked their secure corporate mailboxes. They were entirely unaware that the registered notices of default were currently sitting on their respective desks, ticking down the hours until their ruin. I did not intend to let them enjoy their fake victory. The era of my silent compliance was over. I dressed for the gala not as the invisible sister, but as the architect of their reckoning. I discarded the muted slate blazers and sensible flats they expected me to wear. My attire for the evening was a weapon. I selected a custom-tailored midnight blue designer gown. The garment featured sharp, structured shoulders and a cascading train, projecting an aura of cold, undeniable authority. I wore a single strand of diamonds around my neck and styled my hair in sleek, polished waves. I did not arrive at the venue alone. A black town car pulled up to the velvet ropes outside the hotel entrance. The valet opened the door. I stepped onto the red carpet flanked by my own specialized phalanx. Chloe walked to my right, wearing a striking emerald column dress. Two of Vanguard Capital's most ruthless corporate litigators walked to my left, dressed in immaculate black tuxedos. We moved as a synchronized unit, radiating a gravity that forced the crowd to part. The transition from the sweltering Texas evening into the air-conditioned grand lobby was seamless. The whispers began the second my heels touched the marble floor. Dallas high society is an insular ecosystem. The attendees recognized wealth, and they recognized power, even if they could not immediately place my face. Photographers stationed along the entrance lowered their cameras, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure. Socialites turned their heads, their conversations halting mid-sentence as our contingent glided toward the main ballroom doors. Inside the venue, the lighting was warm and golden. Waitstaff circulated with silver trays of caviar and vintage wine. I scanned the sea of tuxedos and sequined dresses. It took less than a minute to locate my targets. Chase and Richard were holding court in the VIP lounge section, surrounded by a tight circle of minor politicians and easily impressed investors. Chase was holding a crystal tumbler, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just delivered. Then his gaze drifted across the room. The laughter died in his throat. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound, jarring confusion. He stared at me, trying to reconcile the image of the woman standing in the center of the ballroom with the compliant sibling he had banished from his dining room table 3 months prior. He looked at the midnight blue gown. He looked at the elite legal team flanking my sides. The cognitive dissonance cracked his fragile composure. Chase slammed his tumbler down onto a passing waiter's tray, nearly spilling the amber liquid. His face flushed a dark, violent shade of crimson. He muttered something to his wealthy friends, pointing a rigid finger in my direction. He broke away from the VIP section and marched across the patterned carpet, his heavy footsteps eating up the distance between us. His sycophants trailed closely behind him, eager to witness a confrontation. Richard noticed the sudden movement. My father turned, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized his estranged daughter standing among the city elite. He followed his son, his face tightening with embarrassment and rage. Chase stopped 3 feet in front of me, invading my personal space. He attempted to use his physical height to intimidate me, a tactic that worked effectively when we were teenagers sharing a hallway. Today, it merely highlighted his pathetic lack of emotional control. "What are you doing here?" Chase hissed, his voice vibrating with barely contained panic. "How did you even get past the front door?" I looked at him with an expression of mild, clinical boredom. "I am attending an industry event," I replied, my tone smooth and unbothered. "You do not belong in this room," Chase snapped, gesturing wildly at the opulent surroundings. "This gala is for developers and serious investors. It is an exclusive gathering. You are an embarrassment. You are trying to ruin the most important night of my career because you are a bitter, jealous nobody." His wealthy friends snickered, emboldened by his arrogance. They viewed me as a confused interloper, an annoying relative crashing a high society party. Richard arrived at Chase's side, gripping his son's shoulder. My father leaned in, his voice a low, threatening rumble, designed to force my submission. "Tessa, "You need to leave right now," Richard ordered. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. If you do not walk out those doors voluntarily, I will have you removed." The surrounding guests began to notice the disturbance. The low hum of networking chatter faded into a tense, heavy silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward our standoff. The public boiling point had arrived. Chase did not wait for my response. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers loudly, signaling a pair of broad-shouldered security guards stationed near the grand staircase. "Officers," Chase called out, his voice echoing across the quiet ballroom, "we have a trespasser. Escort my estranged sister off the premises immediately. She is harassing the guests." The guards exchanged a brief look and began walking toward our position, their hands resting on their utility belts. The trap was set perfectly in the open. Chase believed he was exerting his dominance in front of his peers. He thought he was throwing the practice child back into the dirt. He had no idea the executioner was already holding the blade. The security guards moved with the synchronized precision of men paid to handle unpleasant situations quietly. They navigated through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, their eyes locked onto my position. Chase stood a few feet away, his chest puffed out, radiating a smug satisfaction. He loved having an audience. He thrived on it. 10 years ago, during a crowded family dinner celebrating my high school graduation, he stood up and mockingly toasted my lack of university scholarships, turning my financial anxiety into a punchline for our wealthy relatives. He used public shame as a tool to shrink my presence. Tonight, he believed the script was identical. He thought he could snap his fingers and erase me from his moment of triumph. The ballroom held its collective breath. The string quartet playing softly in the corner faded into the background. The local politicians and real estate barons watched with hungry curiosity, eager to see the golden boy discard a supposed interloper. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I stood my ground, flanked by Chloe and my legal team, waiting for the exact moment the pendulum would swing. Up on the grand stage, Gregory Langdon stood at the acrylic podium. Gregory was the chairman of the Dallas Real Estate Board, a man who controlled municipal zoning approvals and dictated the flow of institutional money in the city. He was preparing to announce the keynote awards. He glanced down at his notes, then looked up to see why the room had grown so quiet. His gaze swept over the crowd and landed on the confrontation unfolding near the VIP lounge. He saw the security guards closing in. Then he saw my face. Gregory Langdon's current flagship commercial plaza was a massive undertaking that nearly filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago. Traditional lenders had abandoned him. It was Vanguard Capital that injected the necessary liquidity to save his reputation, and I was the one who personally structured his rescue package. He knew exactly who held his leash. He knew the woman standing in the midnight blue gown was not a trespasser. Gregory dropped the microphone. It hit the podium with a loud, jarring thud that echoed through the high-definition speakers. He did not bother walking down the carpeted side stairs. He practically vaulted off the edge of the stage, his polished shoes hitting the floor with heavy urgency. He sprinted past the catered buffet tables, cutting a direct path through the bewildered guests. The security guards were mere inches away from me, raising their hands to initiate an escort. Gregory intercepted them, waving his arms in a frantic motion. He ordered the guards to stand down, his voice breathless and panicked. The men in dark suits stepped back immediately, recognizing the authority of the event chairman. Chase smiled widely, stepping forward. He extended his hand toward Gregory, assuming the powerful chairman had rushed over to personally defend the star of the evening. Gregory ignored Chase's outstretched hand entirely. He walked right past my brother, stopping 2 feet in front of me. The titan of Dallas real estate smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, caught his breath, and bowed his head in a gesture of profound deference. "Madam CEO," Gregory said, his voice carrying clearly into the sudden vacuum of silence, "we were not expecting you to attend. It is a profound honor to have Vanguard Capital represented at this gala. Please allow me to escort you to the primary sponsor table." The words hung in the air, shifting the atmospheric pressure of the entire room. The title CEO and the name Vanguard Capital carried a mythical weight among this specific crowd. They were the apex predators of the financial district, the invisible force that funded or dismantled their skylines. The collective gasp from the surrounding elite was audible. It was a sharp intake of breath from dozens of wealthy investors simultaneously rearranging their worldview. Chase froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of total, paralyzing confusion. His brain visibly struggled to process the audio. He looked at Gregory, then looked at me, his eyes widening as a catastrophic realization began to take root. He remembered the quiet, drab notary sitting in the corner of the boardroom 3 months ago. He remembered the woman who poured his coffee and stamped his legal doom. The features matched, the puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. Richard stood just behind his son, holding a heavy crystal glass filled with expensive scotch. My father had spent his entire life building a patriarchal facade, demanding compliance and respect from everyone under his roof. He believed he was the ultimate authority. Hearing the most powerful man in the room bow to his discarded daughter shattered his internal reality. The muscles in his hand went lax. The heavy crystal slipped from his grip. It hit the marble border separating the carpet from the bar area and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. The sharp sound of breaking glass pierced the quiet room, mirroring the destruction of his legacy. I stepped forward, the silk train of my gown gliding silently over the floor. I ignored the broken glass and looked directly into my brother's pale, sweating face. My voice was measured, lacking any theatrical emotion, carrying only the terrifying weight of indisputable authority. "I am not trespassing, Chase," I stated, ensuring the surrounding crowd heard every syllable. "I am the primary financial sponsor of this event, and as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I am the legal owner of your Apex project." The whispers erupted. The quiet ballroom mutated into a hive of frantic, hushed conversations. The wealthy investors and local sycophants, who had spent the last hour fawning over Chase, performed a synchronized physical retreat. They literally took a step backward, putting distance between themselves and my brother. In the corporate ecosystem, financial failure is a highly contagious disease. They smelled the blood in the water. They recognized that the golden boy was no longer a rising star. He was a walking liability. "You missed the municipal zoning filing by 72 hours, I continued, delivering the facts with surgical precision. "The automated margin call was dispatched to your corporate office at noon. Your 90-day grace period expired. You failed to produce the principal $5 million. Vanguard Capital has executed the accelerated default clause you willingly signed." Chase opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. The tailored cobalt suit that projected new money suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The illusion he spent years cultivating was publicly, surgically eviscerated in front of the exact audience he desperately wanted to impress. He was stripped of his title, his project, and his social currency in a matter of seconds. Richard stared at the pieces of shattered crystal on the marble floor. The implications of the default clause were crashing down upon him. He remembered the collateral annex. He realized that the foreclosure did not just seize the commercial dirt pit downtown. It meant Vanguard Capital now possessed the legal rights to his sprawling residential estate, his vaulted ceilings, and his imported entryways. He had traded his fortress to fund a mirage, and the mirage had just evaporated. The confrontation was no longer a private family dispute held over a mahogany dining table. It was a public execution. The elite crowd watched with predatory fascination, their allegiances shifting instantaneously to the woman holding the deeds. I stood unbothered under the warm chandelier light, watching the two men who banished me grapple with their sudden, spectacular ruin. But Chase was not ready to surrender his identity. The shock began to wear off, replaced by a frantic, unhinged denial that would push the confrontation to an entirely new level of public hysteria. The silence in the grand ballroom did not last. The initial shock permeating the elite crowd rapidly dissolved, replaced by a frantic, vibrating tension. Chase could not process the reality of his defeat. For 28 years, his entire existence had been cushioned by unearned bailouts and manufactured victories. Whenever he encountered a barrier, our father simply wrote a check or made a phone call to clear the path. Faced with a lethal financial snare that no amount of charm could undo, Chase's brain defaulted to the only defense mechanism he knew. He resorted to volume. His face contorted into a mask of desperate hysteria. The polished, visionary developer vanished, leaving behind a cornered, panicked fraud. Chase lunged forward, stabbing a finger through the air toward my face. "She is lying," Chase shrieked, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The sound was shrill, lacking any trace of his usual smooth baritone. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is a bitter, jealous spinster, making up stories because she cannot stand to see me succeed. She is a corporate thief trying to hijack my project." He spun around, appealing to the wealthy investors and local politicians who had been hanging on his every word just moments prior. He threw his arms wide, gesturing frantically. "You all know me," Chase pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead and rolling down his temples. "You know what I am building. She hacked into a database. She fabricated those default notices. My funding is secure. Vanguard Capital would never put a nobody like her in charge of $1 billion asset portfolio." The crowd did not respond with sympathy. They responded with cold, calculating scrutiny. In the upper echelons of Dallas real estate, reputations are fragile currencies. The men and women in the room were predators in their own right. They watched his erratic behavior, noting the sweat soaking his collar and the frantic pitch of his voice. They looked from his unhinged display back to my unbidding, serene posture. The contrast was damning. Richard saw his son's carefully constructed empire evaporating in real time. My father had spent 4 decades demanding blind compliance from everyone in his orbit. He ruled our household through intimidation, silencing any dissenting opinions with a sharp bang of his fist against the dinner table. He firmly believed his patriarchal authority extended beyond his front door. He thought he could simply order reality to bend to his will. Richard stepped in front of Chase, acting as a physical shield. He puffed out his chest, squaring his heavy shoulders to project dominance. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a familiar, toxic rage. "Tessa, stop this nonsense right now," Richard barked. His voice was a deep, gravelly command, designed to trigger my childhood obedience. "You are humiliating this family. You are going to turn around, walk out those doors, and we will handle this misunderstanding in private. Do you hear me? Stand down." He expected me to shrink. He expected the 32-year-old woman standing before him to revert into the terrified teenager who used to hide in her bedroom to avoid his temper. He anticipated a quiet apology and a swift retreat. I did not shrink. I did not break eye contact. The era of my submission ended the night he called me a practice child. I raised my right hand, offering a brief, silent signal to my left. Chloe stepped forward, opening her leather portfolio. She handed me a sleek silver tablet. The device was already synced to the ballroom's audiovisual system, a technical integration easily arranged when your firm is the primary financial underwriter for the entire gala. I turned away from my father and walked toward the acrylic podium resting on the edge of the grand stage. Gregory Langdon, the event chairman, stepped aside, respectfully gesturing for me to take the microphone. I placed the tablet onto the slanted podium stand. I tapped the glass screen once. High above the stage, the massive digital media displays flickered. The elegant, swirling logo of the Dallas Real Estate Gala vanished. In its place, a crisp, high-definition PDF document illuminated the room. It was the final page of the Vanguard Capital mezzanine loan agreement. The text was blown up to 30 feet wide, rendering every legal clause legible to the hundreds of guests standing on the patterned carpet. Near the bottom of the screen, the bold, looping signature of Chase Henry was displayed in pristine clarity. Right below it, serving as the primary guarantor, was the unmistakable signature of Richard Henry. I leaned into the microphone. My voice resonated through the surround sound speakers, cutting through the murmurs and filling every corner of the opulent space. "I am not humiliating the family, Richard," I stated, my tone devoid of anger, but heavy with terminal authority. "I am foreclosing on it." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the crowd. I swiped my finger across the tablet screen, transitioning the display to a detailed, itemized ledger. I was not going to simply announce his failure. I was going to provide a forensic autopsy of his incompetence. "Let us review the visionary genius of the Apex development," I continued, my voice steady and rhythmic. 3 months ago, Vanguard Capital provided a $5 million bridge loan to cover a critical construction deficit. Those funds were earmarked for structural engineering and expedited supply chain logistics. Instead, the borrower allocated the capital to sustain an illusion of wealth. I tapped the screen, highlighting specific line items in bright red. $200,000 was wired to a digital marketing agency to purchase highway billboards featuring the developer's face, I recited, reading the indisputable data. $80,000 was spent leasing luxury vehicles. $50,000 was squandered on private catering at this very hotel to secure a table for tonight's event. Meanwhile, the actual foundation of the commercial site remains a vacant dirt pit. The municipal zoning permits were ignored. The 90-day legal deadline was breached. The guest stared at the screen, reading the itemized proof of his financial negligence. The investors, who had previously pledged soft commitments to the Apex project, exchanged dark, furious glances. Chase had lied to them. He had promised a state-of-the-art luxury high-rise, yet he was burning institutional capital on personal vanity. The judgment of his peers was instantaneous and brutal. The wealthy socialites and real estate barons who had worshipped his leased Porsche and tailored suits now looked at him with sheer, unfiltered disgust. They stepped further away, leaving Chase and Richard isolated in a wide, empty circle on the red carpet. Chase looked up at the towering digital screen. He saw his own signature. He saw the documented evidence of his fraud broadcast to the entire city. The fabricated narrative he had maintained for years finally shattered, and the sharp fragments tore his identity to shreds. The oxygen seemed to vanish from his lungs. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of his public ruin. Chase dropped to the floor, his expensive suit wrinkling as he hit the carpet. He landed on his hands and knees, hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He stared at the intricate pattern of the rug, paralyzed by the realization that he owned nothing. The cars, the dinners, the accolades, they were all funded by money that now legally belonged to the sister he relentlessly mocked. He was a hollow shell, bankrupt in every conceivable metric. Richard looked down at his son, his patriarchal armor cracking. The booming voice and the aggressive posturing were useless against airtight corporate law. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, stripped of their social currency and exposed as frauds. But narcissism does not surrender easily. When intimidation fails and the truth is laid bare, the desperate mind pivots to manipulation. Richard slowly lifted his head, turning his gaze away from his hyperventilating son and fixing it back on me. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a frantic, sickening panic. He realized he was about to lose his sprawling estate. He realized his kingdom was gone. The transition from arrogant dominance to toxic begging was imminent, setting the stage for a desperate ultimatum that would test the very limits of family loyalty. The massive digital screen above the stage continued to project the itemized ledger of ruin. The stark red numbers bathed the ballroom in a harsh, unforgiving light. The Dallas elite, the people my father and brother spent their entire lives trying to impress, had formed a wide, empty circle around us. It was a quarantine zone. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, failure is treated like a terminal illness, and no one wanted to catch the infection. Richard realized the silence was permanent. He looked at the averted eyes of the politicians and the cold stares of the investors. The patriarchal armor he wore for 40 years cracked and shattered, leaving a desperate, aging man standing on the patterned carpet. When raw intimidation fails a narcissist, they instinctively pivot to the next tool in their arsenal. They resort to emotional extortion. My father closed the distance between us. He bypassed the podium, his heavy leather shoes sinking into the carpet. He reached out and grabbed my bare arm. His fingers dug into my skin, a harsh, bruising grip that transported me back to my childhood. When I was 10 years old and accidentally spilled a glass of water in his pristine study, he grabbed my arm with that exact same pressure, dragging me out of the room while lecturing me about respect and precision. Tonight, there was no lecture. There was only panic. "Tessa, you have to tear up this contract right now," Richard hissed. His voice dropped to a gravelly, frantic whisper, intended only for my ears. He was terrified the surrounding crowd would hear him beg. "You cannot do this to us. You are my daughter. I raised you. I put a roof over your head. You owe me your loyalty. We are blood." I looked down at his thick, trembling fingers wrapped around my arm. I did not flinch. I did not pull away immediately. I let him hold on for 3 seconds, forcing him to feel the cold, rigid tension in my muscles. I wanted him to understand that his physical touch no longer induced fear. "Let go of me, Richard," I commanded, my voice flat and echoing slightly through the microphone I still held in my other hand. I wrenched my arm free. The sudden movement threw him off balance. He stumbled backward, his face flushing a dangerous dark crimson. The facade of the concerned, loving father dissolved instantly, replaced by a vicious, cornered animal. If he could not manipulate my guilt, he would try to terrorize my livelihood. "You think you can just steal my home?" Richard screamed, his voice rising, abandoning any attempt at discretion. He pointed a trembling finger at the Vanguard Capital logo displayed on the screens. "I will sue you into the ground. I will hire the most aggressive litigators in Texas. I will tell the judge you used predatory lending tactics to trick your own family. I will go to the press. I will drag your pristine corporate name through the mud until every investor in this state knows you are a manipulative, vindictive thief. I will destroy your firm." His threats cascaded over me like water hitting a stone wall. He was a man accustomed to settling disputes by throwing money at lawyers, threatening lawsuits to bury smaller contractors who dared to demand payment. He assumed Vanguard Capital operated on the same fragile, defensive principles as his local hardware suppliers. He failed to grasp the magnitude of the entity he was threatening. I met his frantic outburst with an eerie, unbroken silence. I let his words hang in the air, allowing the surrounding crowd to witness his pathetic, flailing desperation. "You cannot sue me for a contract you willingly signed," I replied smoothly, my voice projecting across the ballroom with surgical calm. "You sat in a boardroom, drank my coffee, and reviewed every clause. You traded your family estate to fund a lie because you wanted to play the role of the visionary patriarch. You bet your kingdom on a pair of weak hands. Vanguard did not trick you. We merely handed you the rope, and you tied the knot yourself." Before Richard could formulate a rebuttal, a pathetic sound emerged from the floor. Chase was still on his hands and knees on the red carpet. The tailored cobalt suit, the symbol of his supposed new money status, was crumpled and stained with sweat. The golden boy, the masterpiece my father had toasted at the steakhouse just 3 months ago, was actively unraveling. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked sobs. "Tess, please," Chase wept, tears streaming down his face, ruining his manicured appearance. "Please do not do this. The apex was everything. I have nothing else. The banks will not touch me. My investors are gone. I will lose the car. I will lose the condo. I cannot go bankrupt." He crawled forward, closing the gap between us. He reached out, his shaking hands hovering just inches from the hem of my midnight blue designer gown. He was literally groveling at my feet in front of the most powerful people in Texas. "I will work for you," Chase begged, his voice thick with mucus and desperation. "I will do whatever you want. Give me a job at Vanguard. I can be your assistant. I can fetch your coffee. I know real estate. I can help you manage the portfolio. Just please, Tessa, give me a salary. Do not leave me out here with nothing." The sheer pathetic nature of the display cemented the permanent power shift. This was the brother who laughed when I was called the practice child. This was the man who told me to avoid getting a speeding ticket in my sensible sedan. Now he was offering to carry my briefcase, pleading for a desk in the shadow of my empire. I looked down at him, feeling a profound, clinical detachment. I did not feel pity. Pity requires a foundation of mutual respect. I only saw a consequence. Vanguard Capital does not employ liabilities, Chase, I stated clearly. We hire competence. You have never successfully managed a project in your life without a bailout. Your resume is a fiction. You have nothing to offer my firm. Chase collapsed backward, sitting on his heels, burying his face in his hands. His loud, racking sobs echoed through the quiet room, a harsh soundtrack to the destruction of his identity. Richard watched his son cry. The sight did not evoke paternal compassion. It evoked disgust. My father despised weakness. He had spent his life projecting strength, and seeing his designated successor weeping on a ballroom floor shattered his final illusion. Richard turned away from Chase, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered venom. He directed his entire reservoir of hatred onto me. "You think you are a genius," Richard snarled, his voice dropping into a low, venomous register. He took a slow, menacing step toward the podium. "You stand up there in your expensive dress, surrounded by your fancy corporate lawyers, acting like you conquered the world. You think you built this supposed empire all by yourself." He sneered, a cruel, mocking expression that I recognized from 1,000 childhood arguments. "You are nothing without me," Richard proclaimed, stabbing his finger toward his own chest. "I put the fire in your belly. My discipline forged you. Every ounce of success you have is because of the name I gave you and the environment I built. You are trying to ruin me to prove a point, but the truth is, you owe your entire existence to me. I made you." The ballroom remained dead silent, waiting to see how the billionaire chief executive would respond to the ultimate patriarchal claim. The wealthy onlookers expected me to defend my work ethic, to list the hours I spent building my firm, or to demand recognition for my individual achievements. They did not know that Richard had just handed me the key to the final vault. He claimed he made me. He claimed he built my foundation. He believed he was taking credit for my ambition. He was entirely oblivious to the literal, legal truth hidden behind his words. The trap I set 3 months ago was merely the secondary mechanism. The primary snare had been waiting in the dark for a decade, quietly gathering interest, waiting for the exact moment he tried to claim ownership of my life. I looked at the man who had discarded me, feeling a cold, precise smile form on my lips. The final stage was set. The devastating piece of evidence I'd kept hidden for 10 years was ready to be brought into the light. "You made me," I echoed. The words left my lips with a frigid, metallic resonance. The ambient heat in the grand ballroom seemed to plummet, replaced by a biting, sterile chill. I reached into my midnight blue designer clutch. My fingers bypassed my phone and rested on a folded, stiff piece of paper. It was not a digital file displayed on a tablet. It was a physical relic, yellowed at the edges and preserved in a clear archival sleeve. I pulled the document into the light. "Let us discuss the exact mechanics of how you made me, Richard," I said. I turned my gaze away from his sweating face and addressed the silent, captive audience. The real estate titans, the local politicians, and the wealthy socialites all leaned forward, sensing the final, fatal blow hovering in the air. 10 years ago, I was 18 years old, I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear over the surround sound system. It was the year I was supposed to leave for university. It was also the year my father's original regional construction firm quietly went bankrupt. He had over-leveraged his commercial assets, skipped crucial federal tax payments, and found himself staring down the barrel of severe internal revenue liens. I stepped away from the acrylic podium, walking slowly across the patterned carpet. I held the yellowed paper up for the front row of investors to see. To avoid losing his prized residential estate and his fleet of luxury vehicles, my father executed a parasitic financial maneuver, I continued, delivering the facts with surgical precision. He stole my Social Security number. He forged my signature on multiple banking forms. He secretly registered a toxic shell corporation in my name, transferring all his outstanding radioactive debt into that new entity. He dumped his financial poison onto his practice child. Richard stood frozen. The belligerent patriarch who had just claimed he forged my ambition was rapidly losing his color. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single syllable. He recognized the archival sleeve. He knew the document in my hand was the original Articles of Incorporation. The crowd murmured in horror. Embezzling from an anonymous institutional investor was considered a standard, albeit risky, corporate crime. But committing identity theft against your own teenage daughter violated the deepest unspoken taboos of their elite social circle. The wealthy patrons viewed him not just as a financial failure, but as a moral void. They looked at the man who boasted about family legacy and saw a predator who fed on his own bloodline. I looked down at Chase. The golden boy was still kneeling on the red carpet. He had stopped sobbing. He stared up at our father with wide, bloodshot eyes. For the first time in his pampered, curated existence, Chase understood the true nature of the man who raised him. He realized that Richard's loyalty was a transactional illusion. If my father was willing to sacrifice his 18-year-old daughter to the federal government to save his golf membership, he would never hesitate to sacrifice his son. The betrayal fractured whatever microscopic bond they had left. Chase shifted his weight, physically recoiling from the man standing next to him. I did not declare bankruptcy, I stated, pacing back toward the center of the stage, forcing the audience to focus on my voice. I did not run away from the wreckage. I absorbed the poison you injected into my life. For 4 years, I worked 3 separate jobs. I poured coffee at a transit station at dawn, filed data entry reports during the day, and scrubbed commercial office floors until midnight. I lived on instant noodles and slept 4 hours a night. Every single paycheck I earned went directly toward paying off the federal liens and settling the fraudulent debts you created. I paused, letting the crushing weight of those 4 years settle over the silent, opulent room. When I asked you for help paying my university tuition, I reminded Richard, my tone hollow and unyielding. You sat in your leather study, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, and told me I was simply irresponsible with money. You instructed our relatives to stop speaking to me. You branded me a financial failure to cover your own tracks. You told everyone I was a bad investment. Richard staggered backward a fraction of an inch, as if struck by an invisible physical blow. The reality of his own historical cruelty was crashing down upon him, broadcast in high definition to the exact peers he worshipped. But I did not just pay off the balance, I revealed, shifting the narrative from a recounting of trauma to a tactical unmasking. Once the debt was cleared, I possessed a fully registered, legally viable corporate entity. Most victims of identity theft would dissolve the shell company and try to forget the nightmare. I am not most people. I held the yellowed paper high above my head, the chandelier light catching the plastic sleeve. I kept the limited liability company, I declared. I spent my nights studying corporate law, tax codes, and private equity structures. I scrubbed the entity clean. I used its established filing history and its chronological age to demonstrate corporate maturity to my first angel investors. You gave me a company with a 5-year operating history. You inadvertently granted me the institutional credibility I needed to access high-yield mezzanine markets. I weaponized the very cage you built to lock me away. I lowered the document, locking my eyes directly onto Richard's ashen, terrified face. I changed the operating name of that shell corporation, Richard. I rebranded it. I gestured toward the massive digital screen projecting the foreclosure contract. The elegant, swirling logo of my firm hovered above his forged signature. I built Vanguard Capital, right on top of the toxic foundation you laid, I said, the revelation landing like a physical strike. The firm that just seized your commercial development, the firm that now holds the senior lien on your sprawling estate, is the exact same legal entity you fraudulently created in my name a decade ago. The architectural brilliance of the revenge was laid bare for everyone to witness. It was a flawless, inescapable, closed loop of poetic justice. My father thought he was tossing his garbage into an incinerator. Instead, he planted a seed in radioactive soil, and it grew into an apex predator that returned to consume his entire kingdom.
You did not just fund my empire, I concluded, my voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register. You legally created it. Richard stared at his own hands. These were the same hands that had forged my signature 10 years ago. Those identical hands had just signed away his multi-million-dollar home to the exact same corporate tax identification number. He had spent his life believing he was the smartest man in every room, a master manipulator who could use his own children as disposable assets. Now he was trapped in a labyrinth of his own meticulous design. By tricking his daughter to save his wealth, he had inadvertently manufactured the instrument of his ultimate ruin. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The Texas elite stood paralyzed, processing the sheer, brutal elegance of the corporate maneuver. I had not broken a single law. I had not raised my voice. I merely allowed my father's chronic narcissism to orchestrate his own financial suicide. However, narcissists do not surrender their delusions easily. Even when confronted with undeniable, documented proof of their own demise, their brains scramble to find a loophole. Richard looked at the yellowed paper in my hand, and a new, twisted logic began to form behind his desperate eyes. He was about to make one final, catastrophic attempt to claim ownership of my success, setting the stage for a legal checkmate that would permanently sever his ties to the world of the living. The grand ballroom remained locked in a breathless suspension. The Texas elite stood paralyzed, their champagne flutes hovering forgotten in the warm chandelier light. They were watching a billionaire chief executive dissect a patriarchal fraud with surgical precision. My father stared at the yellowed articles of incorporation I held in my hand. His chest heaved as his mind raced through the implications. I knew Richard intimately. I knew his cognitive patterns. He was a man who spent his entire career surviving by locating the smallest contractual loopholes. When he ran his original construction firm, he routinely avoided paying local subcontractors by burying arbitration clauses deep within 50-page work orders. He survived on technicalities. Right now, trapped under the glaring spotlight of his own ruin, his brain sought a familiar escape route. I watched the profound terror in his eyes slowly curdle into a grotesque, calculating greed. He looked at the Vanguard Capital logo projected on the massive digital screen. He looked at me, taking a slow, measured breath to steady his shaking frame. He actually believed he had found a lifeline. "Tessa," Richard began, his voice stammering slightly before he forced a veneer of false confidence over his words. "If what you are saying is true, then we have a very different conversation to have." He took a step forward, straightening his posture, attempting to reclaim the role of the seasoned negotiator. Chase remained on the floor, lifting his tear-stained face, watching our father with a fragile, pathetic glimmer of hope. "You just admitted it in front of a room full of witnesses," Richard declared, sweeping his arm toward the silent crowd. "You stood on this stage and stated that I created the originating shell corporation. I provided the foundational structure. I am the actual founder of the entity that became Vanguard Capital. Therefore, I hold a constructive equity stake in your firm." A wave of muted revulsion rippled through the audience. The sheer audacity of his pivot was staggering. He had just been exposed for committing identity theft against his teenage daughter, yet his immediate reflex was to try and monetize his own crime. "We do not need to argue about foreclosures or missed deadlines," Richard continued, his tone shifting into a patronizing, transactional cadence. "If I hold originating equity, then the Apex loan was an internal capital transfer between partners. You owe me my percentage of the corporate profits. We can settle this tonight.
I will retain my estate, Chase keeps his commercial site, and I will accept a formal seat on your executive board to compensate me for my seed investment." He reached his hand out, palm facing upward, demanding his unearned share. He was desperately trying to salvage a microscopic piece of the fortune, attempting to spin a decade of abuse into a lucrative business partnership. I did not interrupt him. I allowed his words to ring through the opulent space, giving the assembled real estate barons ample time to study the depths of his moral bankruptcy. When he finally finished speaking, I lowered the archival sleeve. I smiled. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a cold, terrifying expression that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of an architect watching a trespasser step directly onto the final pressure plate of a meticulously designed snare. "You really do not understand corporate law, Richard," I said softly. My voice did not need to be loud to command the room. The quiet, melodic rhythm of my words carried a lethal certainty. "Let us review the legal mechanics of your seed investment," I suggested, stepping away from the podium and walking toward him. 10 years ago, you were hiding from federal tax investigators. To ensure the Internal Revenue Service could never trace those assets back to you, you required a pristine, unconnected proxy. You forged my signature and used my Social Security number to register that limited liability company. I stopped just out of his physical reach, holding his gaze. By doing so, you legally designated me as the sole managing proprietor, I explained, articulating each syllable with razor-sharp clarity. You deliberately excluded your own name from every single filing document to avoid federal prison. You surrendered all equitable claims the moment you submitted that fraudulent paperwork to the state registry. You cannot claim a constructive trust on an entity you legally swore you did not own. If you attempt to sue me for equity, you will have to stand in a court of law and confess to felony tax evasion and identity theft. The statute of limitations on bank fraud is 10 years. You would not get a seat on my executive board. You would get a federal cell. Richard's outstretched hand began to tremble. The false confidence fractured, leaving him exposed to the chilling reality of his situation. He opened his mouth, but the patronizing negotiator was gone. "But the trap is much deeper than a simple statute of limitations," I continued, twisting the metaphorical blade. "I want you to understand the exact nature of the transaction you authorized this morning." I gestured to Chloe. My senior partner stepped forward, retrieving a crisp, heavy stock document from her leather portfolio. She handed it to me. It was not a digital rendering. It was the finalized, notarized deed of transfer, executed by the municipal clerk just 2 hours ago. "When you sat in my boardroom and signed that mezzanine loan agreement, you believed you were pledging your assets to a faceless shadow lender," I stated, holding the crisp document up to the light. "You pledged your sprawling residential estate, your retirement portfolios, and Chase's commercial dirt pit as hard collateral." I took a step closer, forcing Richard to look at the official state seal stamped at the bottom of the page. "Because you fraudulently established that entity in my name a decade ago, Vanguard Capital is my sole legal property," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "When you signed the default clause, you did not just lose your house to a bank. You legally transferred your entire net worth directly into the very shell corporation you abandoned." The color drained from his face entirely. His breathing stopped. "I did not steal your money, Richard," I declared, the finality of the statement ringing like a gavel strike. "By your own fraudulent design, you gifted it to me." The logic was airtight. It was legally bulletproof and utterly devastating. The municipal transfer was permanent. There was no arbitration board that could reverse a transaction built on his own verified signatures. The crowd absorbed the sheer magnitude of the strategy. The trap was not set 3 months ago when Chase submitted his desperate application. The trap was set 10 years ago by Richard's own greed. He had spent a decade funding his country club lifestyle, entirely unaware that he was simply decorating a house he had already signed over to the daughter he discarded. He was entirely bankrupt by his own hand. Chase let out a raw, guttural sound from the floor.
He covered his ears, unable to process the destruction of his reality. He was a 30-year-old man who possessed no skills, no assets, and no future. The golden boy was reduced to a cautionary tale. Richard swayed on his feet. The heavy, patriarchal titan looked small, fragile, and exceptionally old. He stared at the deed of transfer, realizing he had nothing left to leverage. He could not yell his way out of the math. He could not intimidate a registered deed. He was a king without a kingdom, standing on a rented carpet, surrounded by peers who now viewed him with unfiltered contempt. I reached into the pocket of my midnight blue gown. I retrieved a small, custom-printed piece of heavy cardstock. It was an official Vanguard Capital corporate check. The elegant logo was embossed in the top corner. During those 4 years I spent scrubbing floors and pouring coffee, I calculated the exact amount of money you stole from my future, I said quietly. I promised myself I would clear the ledger. I held the check out between my index and middle finger. I had personally filled out the payee line with Richard's full legal name. In the numeric box, I had written the sum of exactly $1.00. I released my grip. The crisp piece of paper fluttered through the air, drifting down until it landed softly on the patterned carpet, resting just inches from the toe of his expensive leather shoe. Paid in full, I stated. The transaction was complete. The generational debt was canceled. I turned my back on the two men kneeling in the wreckage of their own narcissism. I did not wait for a response because there was nothing left for them to say. The era of the practice child was officially closed, leaving only the unbothered architect standing in the center of the room, preparing to walk out into the cool Texas night. The crisp Vanguard Capital check rested on the patterned carpet, a single piece of paper holding the weight of a canceled decade. I turned my back on Richard and Chase, walking toward the VIP exit. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not need to verify their reactions. The heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the grand ballroom provided all the confirmation required. Gregory Langdon raised 2 fingers, silently instructing his personal security detail to finish the task. 4 men in dark suits approached my father and brother. They did not shout. They did not brandish weapons. They simply pointed toward the main double doors, their posture radiating an unyielding mandate. Richard stared at the dollar bill on the floor. He did not pick it up. He slowly rose to his feet, his knees popping in the quiet room. The patriarchal titan who walked into the gala expecting to rule the Dallas elite now shuffled forward like a hollow shell. Chase struggled to stand, his tailored cobalt suit stained with sweat and dust from the carpet. He wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve, a pathetic gesture that drew disgusted scowls from the nearby investors. The crowd parted, forming a wide, unobstructed path to the exit. Nobody offered a sympathetic whisper. Nobody extended a handshake. In the ruthless ecosystem of high society, proximity to failure is a fatal risk. The local politicians who had drank my father's expensive scotch just an hour prior now turned their backs, suddenly fascinated by the string quartet playing softly in the corner. The golden boy and his architect walked the length of the ballroom in total isolation, carrying the crushing weight of their public ruin. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them, sealing their banishment from the world they worshipped. The aftermath commenced with the surgical precision of a corporate machine. The legal framework of American finance moves slowly until the final signature is verified, and then it strikes with breathtaking speed. At 8 o'clock the following morning, the Texas sun was already baking the pavement of the northern suburbs. A fleet of black utility vehicles bearing the Vanguard Capital asset recovery insignia pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the Henry estate. My legal team had filed the electronic transfer deeds at dawn. A county sheriff accompanied the property managers, holding a certified eviction mandate. My mother, Brenda, answered the front door wearing a silk robe, holding her morning coffee. She had spent the previous evening at home, blissfully unaware of the execution that took place downtown. She expected a delivery courier. Instead, she found a locksmith carrying a heavy drill. The reality of her complicity arrived without a warning. She had spent 30 years looking the other way while Richard bullied his children and fabricated his wealth.
She enjoyed the vaulted ceilings and the imported marble, choosing comfortable ignorance over moral friction. Her ignorance expired the moment the locksmith bypassed the brass deadbolt and changed the locks on her sanctuary. Simultaneously, a flatbed tow truck backed into the wide circular driveway. Chase emerged from the guest house, wearing wrinkled sweatpants, his eyes red and swollen. He watched helplessly as a repossession agent attached thick steel chains to the undercarriage of his leased Porsche Carrera. The mechanical whine of the hydraulic winch filled the quiet suburban air, dragging the symbol of his supposed visionary genius onto the steel bed. He did not yell. He did not try to stop them. He simply stood on the manicured lawn, an empty vessel stripped of his armor. By noon, Richard, Brenda, and Chase stood on the sidewalk surrounded by a haphazard pile of designer luggage. The asset managers secured the perimeter, locking the heavy front doors. The family attempted to activate their safety net. Richard pulled out his cellular phone, dialing the private numbers of the bank presidents and country club board members he considered close friends. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The social exile was instantaneous. The Dallas elite operate on a currency of whispered truths, and the events of the Gala had spread through their network before midnight. Their peers knew about the toxic shell corporation, the identity theft, and the resulting foreclosure. The Henry family was branded with a permanent, radioactive stigma. They could not borrow $1, and they could not secure a dinner reservation. The sprawling brick estate stood behind them, a monument to their vanity that now legally belonged to the daughter they threw away. Without their stolen wealth to act as a buffer, the toxic dynamic of their household collapsed inward. Having nowhere else to go, the three of them were forced to relocate to a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a forgotten industrial suburb near a major highway overpass. The walls were paper-thin. The air smelled of old carpeting and exhaust fumes. The psychological prison they built for themselves was far worse than the physical downgrade. Stripped of his corporate title, Richard spent his days sitting in a cheap vinyl chair, staring at the peeling paint, unable to comprehend his loss of status. Chase paced the narrow hallway, his entitlement mutating into bitter, directionless resentment. The blame game became their new daily ritual. Richard blamed Chase for failing to secure the municipal zoning permits and squandering the bridge loan. Chase screamed back, blaming Richard for committing the original identity theft that gifted me the foundational keys to Vanguard Capital. They turned on each other, trapped in a relentless cycle of mutual destruction. They no longer had a scapegoat to carry their burdens. They were forced to face their own reflection, and the image horrified them. 70 floors above the concrete grid of downtown Dallas, the atmosphere inside the Vanguard Capital penthouse was clean, serene, and perfectly controlled. The frantic noise of the city could not penetrate the thick, soundproof glass windows of my suite. I sat at my desk, reviewing a stack of quarterly projections. The heavy oak door opened, and Chloe walked into the room. She wore a sharp, tailored suit, projecting the unshakable competence that defined our firm. She did not carry a digital tablet. She carried a thick, official folder bearing the seal of the Municipal Recording Office. Chloe placed the folder onto the polished glass surface of my desk. "The asset transition is finalized," Chloe stated, her voice carrying a tone of deep professional satisfaction. "The residential estate in the northern suburbs is currently being prepped for the upcoming luxury auction. The proceeds will be folded into our primary liquidity pool." She tapped her manicured finger against the cover of the folder. "And this is the recorded deed for the commercial site downtown," Chloe continued. "The Apex dirt pit is officially Vanguard property. The engineering team reviewed the soil samples this morning. We can begin pouring the foundation for the new corporate tech hub by next week. We project a 30% return on the initial investment within 2 fiscal quarters." I opened the folder, tracing the raised seal with my thumb. The land that Chase intended to use for a vanity project, a monument to his own ego, was going to be transformed into a practical, highly profitable asset. It would generate genuine revenue, built on a foundation of sound math and rigorous planning. "Excellent work, Chloe," I replied, closing the folder. "Proceed with the groundbreaking schedule." Chloe nodded respectfully and exited the office. leaving me alone in the quiet expanse of my sanctuary. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling Dallas skyline. The glass and steel towers reached toward the Texas sun, monuments to ambition, leverage, and survival. I traced the horizon, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of my own pulse. I did not feel anger toward the men sitting in that cramped apartment near the highway. Anger is a heavy, corrosive emotion that requires constant feeding. It keeps you chained to the people who hurt you, demanding that you continue to validate their existence. I had spent 10 years carrying their toxic debt, scrubbing floors and building an empire in the shadows. I had paid the toll. The ledger was balanced. Looking at the city below, I felt only the quiet, expansive peace of an architect who had just laid the final stone on a masterpiece. My father thought he was writing the story of his life. He believed he was the author, the director, and the undisputed star of the narrative. He looked at his children and assigned us our roles. Chase was drafted as the legendary successor, the golden boy destined to inherit the world. I was designated as the rough draft, the disposable practice child meant to absorb the mistakes and clear the path for the masterpiece. He underestimated the fundamental nature of the creative process. When you force someone to live in the margins, you teach them how to read the fine print. When you hand someone your broken, discarded pieces, you teach them how to build something stronger. The practice child did not just write a better draft. She secured the funding, purchased the printing press, and bought the entire publishing house. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I sat down in my leather chair, opening a new file, preparing to underwrite the next venture. I was unbothered, untouchable, and entirely free. The shadows of the past were permanently excised from my boardroom. It is a harsh, unyielding law of the American corporate landscape, and a lesson my family learned far too late. When you try to use someone as a rough draft for your own failures, you should never be surprised when they rewrite the entire ending. Looking back at the trajectory of the last decade, the distance between the frightened 18-year-old girl holding a fraudulent tax lien and the executive sitting in a glass penthouse feels infinite. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was forged in the quiet, brutal hours before dawn, scrubbing commercial floors and studying corporate tax codes. It required a systematic dismantling of the illusions I was raised to believe. For anyone navigating the suffocating weight of a toxic hierarchy, the blueprint to your freedom requires recognizing a few harsh, undeniable truths. First, silence is your most lethal asset. When the people who are supposed to protect you decide to weaponize your existence, your initial instinct is to scream, to demand justice, or to beg for their understanding. Do not waste your breath. Outrage is a fleeting emotion that signals to your abusers that they still control your temperature. True power lies in observing their patterns, mapping their weaknesses, and executing your strategy without making a sound. Second, blood is a biological fact, not a binding contract for your destruction. Society conditions us to forgive profound betrayals under the guise of family loyalty. But loyalty should never be synonymous with financial or psychological suicide. You are permitted to walk away from a dining room table where you are only served disrespect. Setting an ironclad boundary is not an act of malice. It is an act of essential architecture. Third, vanity is a catastrophic liability. My father and brother built their entire identities on the perception of wealth, driving leased cars and chasing hollow accolades. They traded tangible stability for the applause of strangers. When you base your self-worth on the envy of others, you become a hostage to public opinion. Competence, on the other hand, requires no audience. Hard math and verifiable assets will always outlast a fragile ego. Fourth, financial sovereignty is the ultimate perimeter. You cannot negotiate from a position of weakness. Whether you are saving spare change in a tin box or managing a high-yield portfolio, controlling your own capital means no one can ever leverage your basic survival against you. Money is not just a tool for acquiring luxury. It is the mortar used to build the heavy walls of your sanctuary. Finally, You are not obligated to play the role they assigned you. Narcissists will constantly try to hand you a script where they are the visionary heroes and you are the disposable rough draft. You do not have to read their lines. You possess the agency to strike through their text, take the pen, and construct a narrative where you hold the undisputed authority. If you are currently sitting in the shadows, holding the broken pieces someone else handed you, know that isolation is a phenomenal teacher. Use the quiet to build your empire. If this narrative resonated with your own journey, please take a moment to subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. We explore the intricate dynamics of family, resilience, and the quiet triumphs that redefine our lives. Drop a comment below sharing which of these 5 lessons hit closest to home for you, and tell me what chapter you are currently writing for yourself. Stop waiting for the people who ruined your first draft to applaud your final manuscript. Step into the light, claim your pen, and rewrite the ending.